up and called up the extension office. Our then county horticulture agent, Bob Rackham, brought a new extension specialist out to the vineyard to take a look at things. And Dr. Bernadine Strik made several suggestions for an experiment to test different trellising and training methods that I could try. And I followed those suggestions. And within 2 years, the results were pretty clear. And in the third year, I went and retrained the entire vineyard over to what turned out to be the best practice. As a result, I no longer had a jungle to struggle with, and my crop yield just about doubled. So it's largely in thanks for this valuable help that I became a master gardener. Members have taken over the work on wine grapes, and Dr. Strik has turned her focus to every small fruit but wine grapes. She's become a world-renowned expert on many berry crops. She shares her knowledge in publications, by teaching classes to growers, and by supporting master gardeners. And in fact, if you look at OSU's extension publication catalog, you'll see that almost everything about small fruits has Bernadine's name on it. Bernadine Strik has had a 33-year career with Oregon State University. She's planning on retiring at the end of the year. And we're very fortunate to have her tonight as our speaker to tell us about growing raspberries and blueberries. So Bernadine will be happy to take your questions at the end of her talk tonight. In the meantime, if there's a really hot question that you make sure you want to ask, go ahead and put it into the chat box and we'll catch it there. So Bernadine, welcome. The floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Well, thank you, Alan. Wow, that was quite an introduction. And I remember that visit. And if it encouraged you to become a master gardener, then that was one of the best outcomes in my mind. So thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to share my screen and get that started. And then I am going to, here we go. I'm going to stop my video simply because I think the quality of the presentation will be better, and then I'll turn it back on when I'm done speaking. So Alan, just chime in if you see any problems or anything. And just a reminder that if those of you attending could mute your microphones, because it can be distracting if I hear background sound. So I appreciate that. All right, so this is a big topic, and I'm going to do my best because I get really excited about these crops. Those of you who have heard me speak before can tell I really love my job. I mean, oh my goodness, 33 years of working with berries. The more people I can convert, the better I like it. So what I'm going to do is talk about growing these and tips for growing these in the home garden. And some berries are easier to grow than others. And this is a garden in Monmouth, actually. I noticed they had many berry crops in some of these raised beds, and there aren't many gardens that have this many raised beds, but it's a really nice technique. So where I can, I'll make a point of including this as a way you can grow in some more challenging soils that you might have, like on a city lot, for example, like this one, where the soil can be very compacted. The keys to growing any berries successfully is they need to be in full sun, because there'll be a nice ornamental in the shade, but they won't necessarily fruit very well if they're not in good sun exposure. Also, the soil, pretty much for any berry crop, has to have really good drainage. And the pH of the soil has to be within the required range. So I'm going to talk about that in this presentation. You need to use organic matter prior to planting, work it into the soil in most soils, because that improves aeration and drainage. I won't talk about irrigation, but all of these crops need good irrigation to grow well. Pruning and training is one of the most common questions I get, one of the biggest challenges. People are afraid to prune. So I'm going to cover that for both these crops. And then I'm going to finish with fertilizing properly at the end of each crop, because that is also a challenge, and particularly in blueberries can cause some problems. So All plants take up nutrients best when they're grown at a soil pH that they're adapted to. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about raspberries. And like most berry crops, they're adapted to a soil pH of about 5.6 to 6.5. Now, most garden soils, if any other crops have been grown or lawn, are going to be within this ideal range. But blueberry plants need an acid soil. So they're one of the only berry crops that needs this type of soil. Either way, you should test the soil pH, which is not expensive, and modify it before planting if needed. So I'm going to talk a bit more about this with blueberry. So I just revised all these with some great co-authors. And these are the growing series. We have 4 new ones that were released this year. They're available for free. And what's really nice about these is I worked hard with the co-authors to make these adapted to all of Oregon. We have a separate series for the Oregon coast. But these, I think you'll find are much more useful for you with many more photos. I've also developed pruning modules for both home garden and small farm, and they're for every berry crop, including blueberries and raspberries. And you can, they're self-paced. They do have a registration fee. Buy in bulk, you get a discount. But check those online because I'm getting rave reviews about these, and especially in blueberry, I'd say, which are the most challenging for folks. So let's start with raspberries. Now, they come in lots of colors, and the way to distinguish these from blackberries is that the receptacle or plug stays on the plant when you pick the fruit. So you can clearly see in the bottom that that's a black raspberry, which are native here, not a blackberry, because blackberries are solid fruit. So what distinguishes raspberry, and it's kind of important to understand this, is how they grow. So a primocane is a cane that is typically vegetative, and I'll talk about the exception. It's always a new cane shoot, let's say, that's growing in the first year. So that's a vegetative a cane, a primocane, always in its first year of growth. Then it overwinters. And then in the second year, it's called a floricane. And a floricane always flowers or fruits. So flora is like flowering. So the canes are biennial. So after a portion of a cane or a whole cane fruits and is done fruiting, it dies, making the canes biennial. But the roots and the crown, or the base of the plant, are perennial. So red raspberries can have a rather long lifespan, 15 years or so, especially if they're grown in good soil. But the canes keep going through these cycles. So here's an example of a floricane or summer-bearing raspberry. I'll talk more about this in a minute. And this photo I took in the spring. So we have new primocanes that are starting to grow, and they'll get very tall, 6, 7, 8, 9 feet long, depending on your soil. And then they overwinter. And so the overwintering canes here are shown tied to the trellis. And those now in their second year are called floricanes. And they are breaking bud and starting to produce fruiting laterals. So in any year other than the planting year, we have primocanes and floricanes present on a summer-bearing raspberry like this. Now, all red raspberry types, or yellow clones, they produce suckers, and people call these suckers. Suckers are produced on buds on the roots, and so they can show up pretty much anywhere. So if you're growing red raspberries along your fence, your neighbor probably has red raspberries along their fence. Now, they may enjoy that, maybe not. So they can be an invasive weed. So you need to take care of those and prune them out as you see them when they're not where you want them to be. Now, the raspberries I'm going to talk about include the floricane fruiting or summer-bearing raspberry. They only produce fruit on the floricane, so a cane in its second year of growth, so it needs to overwinter. Then we also have Primocane fruiting raspberries. Most commonly in the nurseries or in publications, you'll see these called everbearers. They produce fruit on the tip of the Primocane, and then if you let that cane over winter, it will also fruit on the base when it's a Floricane. So it can produce 2 crops a year, depending on how we prune it. So I'll talk more about that. And both types of raspberries have red and yellow fruiting ones, or cultivars. So this is from the new Growing Raspberries in Your Home Garden publication. So I've listed quite a few cultivars there and their hardiness zones, because of course this includes Eastern and Central Oregon, so I want more cold hardy ones. Probably my favorite for flavor that's easily available through mail order and local nurseries retail is Cascade Delight for summer bearers. And for ever-bearing red or yellow raspberries, I really like Vintage, which is one of ours from the USDA OSU program. And I like Ann for a yellow one. There are also black and purple raspberries, but I won't talk about those in this presentation. So when you order something from mail order, which I did here, you get a short piece of Primocane. That's an overwintering cane. It's been stored in cold storage. And then you get the roots attached. This is a beautiful plant here, but I'm about to plant it in a container. So I am trimming the roots just so it'll fit. You wouldn't need to do this if you had a raised bed or, more space in your garden. The trick with raspberries, though, is remember they have buds on the roots. So instead of planting this straight down like you would with any plant, the roots straight down, I'm spreading the roots out flat. And then I'm covering that with about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of soil. So this way, the buds that are on those roots, which are fine roots, don't need a lot of energy to get up through that potting soil mix and then get into the sunlight. So this is the way to plant raspberries to get rapid spread of new primocanes. So here's an example where we're planting in a raised bed, and this is for, improved drainage. You can do the same in a home garden where you have walls on the side of the raised bed. Plant them about 2 to 2.5 feet apart, and make sure that the roots where they join that small cane section are about 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep, and the roots are spread out, and you'll start seeing new primocanes growing on where each plant was planted. And these won't fruit in the first year. So there's no fruit in the planting year on a Floricane fruiter. But if this was a Primocane fruiting raspberry, you would see, or an everbearer, you would see a small crop in that first year. So let's talk first about summer bearing raspberries and how to grow and prune those. So they do need a trellis. Typically, we'd have 1 or 2 top wires, and then a couple of lower wires. I'll talk more about, moving those and stuff. Make sure you have a wire tightener, just because of the weight of the crop. Hopefully you'll have a good weight of the crop. It's something where you can tighten it when it starts to sag. And generally, posts will be 6 feet tall, and some way that you can unhook the 2 lower wires. You can see a few different methods here, sort of a half nailed in fence nail, and then some gizmos you can buy from vineyard supply places, and you can make something like shown on the right that's more of a heavier gauge wire. Now, how do we manage these primocanes as they start to grow and then in subsequent years? Well, because these types of raspberries produce new primocanes from their roots, it's easy to grow them in a hedge, a solid row of canes. So after some years, you can't really tell where the plants are that you planted to begin with. And that's what's shown kind of on the left. That's a hedgerow. It's during fruiting, so the Floricanes you can't quite see, but they're producing fruit. They're at the green fruit stage, and the new primocanes are growing up. And on the right, though, is a hedgerow that was made with a T-bar, but it's too wide. And you can kind of picture that any fruit growing into the center is going to be dark and moist, and the bees can't access it very well. And any primocanes growing up in the center, exposed to moisture, get more cane disease. And with such low light, they're not going to be very fruitful next year because they form flower buds in the year that they grow before they overwinter. So if you're having a hedgerow, keep it no wider than about 6 inches to a foot wide to have good yield and quality and less disease. Another way you can grow these is what's called a hill system. This can be on flat ground. It just refers to each clump of canes. I think that's a Scottish term, a hill of canes. And only grows summer bearers in this system where you need to kind of train the canes more. Primocane or everbearing types, they like a hedgerow better. So in the hill system, any suckers or primocanes that come up, outside the row, you would want to prune out during the growing season. You can train them like this, which I'll talk about, or you can spread the canes out more when you're training in the winter and have better fruiting and better bud break. This is an easier, faster way to train. But in the home garden, we all have plenty of time, right? Especially when it's nice out. So you want to prune out any primocanes and do this early in the season. Don't let the plant waste energy on growing all these canes where you don't want them, and prune them as low as you can, or use a tiller or grow them beside grass. There'll be fewer coming up in the grass. So that's a trick, just so that you don't end up with a huge jungle. So you're going to pick the fruit, yum. So typically that's starts about the second, third week in June and goes for about a month. And after fruit harvest on these summer bearers, remember the canes are biennial, so the floricanes start to die. This is a natural process. So when you look at a row like this, you can see those yellowing canes. They are starting to die. And the green canes that stick, a lot of them sticking straight up, are the primocanes, which are important for next year's crop. So what we first go and do is look at the base of the row, or the hedgerow or the hill, and we prune out the dead or dying floricanes. Now notice that the primocanes are this nice green color, and the tan-colored canes are the floricanes. But if in doubt, just look higher up on the cane, because what you're going to see is that dying floricane has all these fruiting laterals on it, these little branches, and that's where you can see the fruit was produced that you picked, hopefully. And so you can see on the left is a bundle of floricanes that were removed from one plant. And you can kind of see what it looks like. There's all that fruiting from the tip of the cane to the base. And that gave us that, 30-day long season. So that's what a dying floricane looks like. And we prune that out. Then we want to tuck the remaining primocanes. Remember, they're important for next year's crop. We don't want to break them. We don't want to tip them or prune them. We just want to leave them unpruned. And we'll tuck them between the trellis wires like this. And you can see they're, at least in this section of row, they're taller than, they're pretty tall. So they've been managed well, irrigated well, it's good soil. And you can, commercial growers chop the prunings between the row, and that returns organic matter and nutrients to the soil. You can compost those. There's no risk to composting these canes, and you can use that in your yard for other purposes. So once the leaves fall off these primocanes, then we can think about managing these primocanes and training them. So here the leaves are off. This is at the Oregon Garden, a plot I helped them establish. And these are summer-bearing raspberries. You can see we've got nice primocanes here. There are some short ones that we can't train. We're going to prune those off that are lying horizontally there. Anything that looks kinked or broken, we'll prune out. And then we just go ahead and we can top them and bundle them like that. You can spread them out more if you had a hedgerow and tie them to wires. That's a really good idea. It looks very nice. And here, that's their kitty. It posed for this picture. It obviously is very photogenic. And what we did here was we arcane trained. And let me show you another picture of that because it's easier to see. This is one of my red raspberry plots, and this is arcane training. Remember I showed you those primocanes were really tall? Think about needing to cut all that fruit off. So this is a way to not need to do that. Even if you didn't want to bundle and use baler's twine to arcane train the whole bundle tight like this, you could spread out the canes and individually tie them on your in your hedgerow or in your single wire trellis like this, and you'll get much higher yield. And it's really pretty. Don't do this part until the end of the winter, because if we get really cold like we did recently, that can lead to more cold injury. So do this as late as possible. So next spring, then we start seeing growth. Now, as soon as we get bud break, here's a trick. It's no longer called a primocane. So you noticed I was calling them primocanes through the winter. And now as soon as it breaks bud, it's in its second year of growth. And now we're going to call it a floricane. So here we have the Floricanes Breaking Bud, and they're producing fruiting laterals. And those fruiting laterals are going to produce fruit, starting with the first ripe fruit at the tip of the fruiting lateral. And then the ripening proceeds towards the base of the lateral. And fruiting laterals at the tip of the floricane will also tend to ripen before the ones that are at the base of the cane. So now let's look at primocane fruiting raspberries. These are unique because the primocanes, when they start growing in any year, the first planting year or when they're mature, at a certain height or number of nodes, they'll start producing flowers, starting at the tip of the primocane and working down. So there on the right, you can see some green fruit at the tip of the primocane. So these do need a trellis to support those canes. And I recommend growing these in a hedgerow. It can be wider just because these are not, because of the nature of how we fruit these. So 1 foot to 1.5 feet wide. You can buy these T-bars and put wires up or do something easier with baler's twine. This really does sort of help the canes manageable. And you can hoe out the edges of your hedgerow to maintain the width of the row to that 1.5 feet, just so you can get in there and pick properly. So this raspberry creates the most confusion for anyone who grows these. First of all, I commonly get, how can I tell which one I have? So I'll help you answer that question. And how do I prune these? Well, how you prune these depends on whether you want to grow them for a single crop, only producing fruit on the primocane, or whether you want to grow them for a double crop, producing an early summer crop in June, July on the floricane, and then a later crop starting in August on the primocane. So I'm going to cover both of those. So here is a plot of primocane fruiting raspberries, again at the Oregon garden. They didn't maintain the row width very well, so now in the winter we're going to have to come in and narrow that so that it's still at 1 foot, 1.5 feet wide. Now, how can I tell these are primocane fruiting raspberries? Remember the photo I showed you earlier of beautiful unbranched canes that were about 8 feet tall of summer-bearing raspberry. No branches at the tip, beautiful, healthy canes. These look different. These have a dead tip on the cane because this is where it produced fruit last autumn. So the portion of the cane, once it's done fruiting, will die. This is true for all raspberries. So you can see the dead fruiting laterals at the tip of these canes. So when we come in to prune these just for a single crop, boy, is it easy to prune. Here we go. We cut everything back to the soil level. We cut all the canes off using a weed whacker or pruners. And what happens then is we start getting new primocanes growing up in the early spring. They continue to grow and they will start fruiting in late August. Now, why would we want to do this when we could get 2 crops? Well, we want to do this if we have a section of row that has this gorgeous summer-bearing raspberry like Cascade Delight that we enjoy eating in June, July. We don't need the summer crop on these because producing 2 crops will reduce the yield and delay the start of your Primocane fruiting crop. With that said, limited space, raised beds, or containers, this is the best type of raspberry to grow. So how do I prune it if I want a double crop, 2 crops during the year? So here we have a Primocane. It's fruiting in late summer, looks great. So now what do? Well, if I go and look at a cane like this, by the time it stops fruiting and I leave it through the winter and I don't prune it, this is what I would see. I'd see this dead tip because it fruited last autumn and there's no live buds left there anymore. So the tip of the cane will die back to where fruiting stopped. And now we have growth starting on the base of the cane. Now it's called a floricane. And floricanes in these raspberries always fruit in June, July. So we're going to get our first crop on this floricane. Now we need to prune these and not make them look like this. This would be kind of ratty looking. So what we do when we have a section of Primocane fruiting raspberries is we just come in and chop off the tops. And then we leave the base of the cane to break bud the following spring and produce that floricane crop. Now, where does your next crop come from? Your next crop comes from the new Primocanes that are going to grow up through these floricanes, flower in June, and start fruiting in August. So that's how we get 2 crops on a Primocane fruiting raspberry. So we would take the dead floricanes out in winter and take the dead tips off the Primocanes when we wanted to grow them for 2 crops. Now, if we have limited space and we want to grow in a raised bed or in a container, we want to choose a good soil. Now, in a raised bed, you can use some of your good garden soil, mix it with some organic matter that'll improve drainage. Compost can be a bit of a sponge, so be careful with that. You want something that improves soil aeration. Raspberries are very sensitive to wet soil. So make sure you've got good drainage and good drainage below the raised bed. If it's sitting on concrete and it becomes a bathtub in winter, that's not good. So plant in a raised bed and prune and train them just like I just talked about, 2 feet, 2.5 feet apart. In a container, a pot, make sure it's 12 to 25 gallons in size and that it has drain holes in the bottom, which is important, again, for good drainage. And in a container, go, I would suggest, to a landscape supply place that sells a really good potting mix. Don't put soil in a container. It'll get too compacted. And they sell really good potting mixes that you can use. And it's affordable if you just have a container. So here's vintage that I'm growing in containers. I've put up kind of a simple trellis there with some 2x2s and some twine. You can see that I've got the floricane crop there. It's fruiting. It's June 27. And my double crop is coming from the primocanes that are growing up through those. They'll start flowering pretty soon, and then we'll start fruiting in August. So what I'll do in the winter is remove the dead floricanes. They'll be short and branched like I showed you earlier. And then the primocanes will just take the dead tips off. Now, a trick in containers when you've got this limited space is the plant will produce a lot more primocanes than the container can support. So early on, when you see your tallest primocanes are about 1 foot long, thin to the best 3, only 3 in a pot. And that will help improve the growth of those primocanes, the quality on the floricanes, and make sure you can keep the raspberries in the pot for several years. So I'm going to finish raspberries with fertilization and then move on blueberries. I get common questions about this. And with fertilization, some of the keys we want to think about is like, what's the correct type of fertilizer I should use? What source of nitrogen in particular? How much should I fertilize with? And what's the best time to apply the fertilizer? And in a home garden and in commercial production, nitrogen is the most important fertilizer nutrient needed. And that's why you always see rates of nitrogen, and rates of all other nutrients is always dependent upon whether your soil needs it or the plant needs it. And in a home garden, typically you're fine choosing a well-balanced fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer like 16/16 or 20/20/20 or something like that. Raspberries take up the nitrate form of nitrogen, which is the most common nitrogen found in these well-balanced fertilizers that you can buy in any yard section of a store. Now, many like to fertilize with organic fertilizers, but organic fertilizers contain nitrogen in the ammonium form. And raspberries don't take up ammonium nitrogen. But remember, I said they were adapted to a higher pH. So if your soil pH is high enough in this range, then in any soil, the ammonium in those organic fertilizers will naturally nitrify or convert to nitrate in your soil. And that means that the raspberry plant will be able to take it up. It just means you have to apply organic fertilizers a little bit earlier than inorganic ones. It takes a little longer for the nitrogen to be available. Rate of nitrogen, how much to apply, depends on planting age. And remember that when I talk about how much nitrogen to apply, it depends on the actual nutrient, the actual amount of nitrogen. And all these fertilizers differ in how much of the product is nitrogen. Like 16/16 has 16% of the weight of that fertilizer is nitrogen. So you have to calculate it. So look in the Growing Raspberries in Your Home Garden publication where I give you the rate and how to calculate how much to put on. And then you want to divide the total. I always give the total rate for the season, for the whole year, the season. And what I want you to do is divide it in half, applying half just before or as growth is starting in the spring, and then the second half about 4 to 6 weeks later. And don't fertilize late in the season. They don't need it late in the season. All right. That's a whirlwind tour of raspberries. Looks like I'm on decent time here. And so now let me kind of cover blueberries, and I hope you're thinking of your questions and either typing them in the chat box or jotting them down so that we can cover any questions you might have. And as I alluded to to the organizers, I'm happy to answer questions about other berries too once we cover these two crops. All right, so blueberries, needless to say, a gorgeous crop, beautiful ornamental, but probably I think what many people find the most frustrating berry to grow in the home garden. And so my goal in my 33 years at OSU has been to try and ease that frustration by providing useful advice, especially for home garden, but also for commercial growers. So here are the really key things that a blueberry plant needs. It needs acid soil, 4.5 to 5.5 pH when measured in water. And you can just send your soil in for a pH test. Blueberries do best with good organic matter in the soil, partly because that's what they're adapted to and they're associated with lots of goodies in the soil with good organic matter. But also organic matter in the soil often improves drainage, which is very critical for blueberries. They're very sensitive to wet soil. So common problems in home garden is soil pH being too high. So basically we're looking at a garden spot It potentially has been lawn before or regular landscape bed. It's been limed in the past, and so the pH is too high. And these are the symptoms you commonly see. And some varieties don't even show symptoms. They just grow poorly and yield poorly if the pH is not correct. So if you're not having success with blueberries, check the soil pH, make sure it's correct. So what I always recommend is testing the soil 6 months prior to planting. So blueberry plants for home gardens typically available in the spring, this time of year. So hopefully test the soil in the fall and modify it if needed. Typically the soil pH will be too high, and you can incorporate elemental sulfur like prill sulfur or a powder sulfur. Prill's a little easier to work with. It's available in garden stores, and that's what you should use, just plain sulfur, nothing else. No other type of product. Don't try and use a fertilizer that's acidifying or anything like that. Elemental sulfur. And what you want to do is incorporate enough to get to the top of the pH range, 5.5. You don't need to go down to 4.5. And you want the soil to be at that 5.5 before you plant. So if you haven't done that, test it now. You can still buy the plants, incorporate the required sulfur, which is in the blueberry publication that I highlighted, and then plant in the fall. Blueberries can easily be planted in the fall. That's what our commercial growers do. So just before planting, incorporate appropriate organic matter. So think about it. What types of organic matter are most commonly available to the home or to the rural-urban interface? Compost, animal manure compost, animal waste compost. None of those are suited to incorporating into the soil prior to planting blueberries. And that's because they all have a high pH of 7 or 8. And many of them have high salts, which blueberries and raspberries are very sensitive to. So don't incorporate those in the soil if you've done all the hard work to get the pH to 5.5 and then till in a bunch of compost. You've just gone backwards and increased the soil pH. So instead, incorporate woody material like bark, pretty much of any tree. Just avoid sequoia if you happen to have any. Woody sawdust works well, and any like wood chips, anything like that, as long as it's not too big a chunk so that water doesn't stay in the soil long enough. So here is a section of row I'm about to plant. Just put about 3 inches deep sawdust on there, just the row where the plants are going to be, and incorporate that. They love this. This is a really good way to very slowly improve soil organic matter, but very importantly also to improve drainage. And even though this sawdust and bark have a low pH, about 4, it doesn't really change the pH of the soil because they don't break down very quickly. So they're kind of inert that way. And that's good. You want to control weeds in blueberry. I'm just going to say that here. It's a convenient spot. Blueberries are terrible competitors against weeds. And sawdust used as a mulch after planting, a couple of inches deep, helps control annual weeds, but in all honesty, does a less desirable job than many of us would like. I've become a real proponent of weed mat, which is a woven black plastic ground cover used by landscapers. But if you're going to use this, you have to irrigate underneath. And notice how I have overlapping pieces and landscape pins so I can pull it open to check my irrigation and to apply any granular products or compost or organic matter when I want to. So in raised beds, and this yard also, we've got blueberries dead center in that raised bed. Just want to make sure that you have like-minded plants, acid-loving plants together in a raised bed as opposed to trying to manage plants that have different soil requirements. Now, growing blueberries works extremely well in containers. but you want to choose an acid potting mix that has really good drainage. So it's difficult to find this in landscape stores because typically they'll make a potting mix suited for bedding plants, which they include lime, which raises the pH. So if you can find something, you know, an upscale landscape place that has a rhododendron type mix that will have no lime added because they are also acid loving, you can buy that, or you can make your own. 50% bark, fine bark, like a Doug fir bark, 40% peat moss, and 10% perlite, and mix that well. You want to put one plant into a container and again have drain holes at the bottom. So there's lots and lots of cultivars. And so this is the new publication. And I only recommend cultivars that taste good. What is the point to go to all this work if it's not going to taste good? Now, there's no such thing as a bad blueberry, but there's certainly a difference in flavor. One of my favorites for being early is Spartan, which is the top center. Blue Crop has a fantastic flavor and is relatively easy to grow. You'll find Top Shelf and Calypso in stores. And I want to point out Mini Blues, which is naturally small. And those are my fingers. It is the best flavored, sweetest blueberry available. And it's brand new from our program. So if you can find that, it is fantastic. And then we have Chandler, which is challenging to prune and not very vigorous. And many get frustrated with Chandler. Then we have Legacy, which is well adapted to the Willamette Valley. It has almost double the yield of the cultivars I was just talking about. And then we have some different types of blueberries, which I'm not going to focus on. You can learn about those in the publication. So the challenge you have is that when you buy these plants, they sell them in bloom this time of year or in bud, like on the left. And commercial growers would never buy a plant like this. So for wholesale nurseries, remove the flower buds in the winter before selling them to commercial growers. Retail nurseries feel that you won't buy plants that aren't in bloom because they're pretty. That makes me the bad guy because I'm going to tell you to remove them. So the plant in a 1 gallon or 2 gallon container like this will grow well. In its first year, it has to have the flowers removed. So this is a Chandler plant before pruning on the left. This is one I bought at a Corvallis nursery. And it's hard to see against the white background, but if you look carefully, you'll see white flower clusters there. And it's also quite bushy. So what I'm doing is I'm removing all the flower clusters by just cutting below them, and then I'm thinning to the best canes. And this is critical because what happens when you do this is you force really good growth, which I'll show you in a second. Now, if your plants are dormant when you buy them, which can also happen, it's easier. You can just look for the fat flower buds that are at the tip of this 1-year-old wood, last year's growth. And those tiny scale-like buds toward the base are the vegetative buds that only produce a shoot. So you can remove these flower buds in the winter on these young nursery plants. But if they're already in bloom, still remove them before they set berries, ideally. So that encourages all this vigorous growth here. And we can see a new shoot. We call those whips coming from the base of the blueberry plant there on the left. That's really important because that's going to be a good renewal cane. And then we also, because we've removed the flowers from the tips of those whips there, we also encourage really good branching on that wood. Instead of having all these short shoots at the tip below the fruit, we're getting strong, vigorous growth like you see on the right. These are both 1 gallon plants that were planted, and you can see how much vigor there is because we've removed the flowers. We can let these fruit next year. Typically, when I go to prune these now in the winter, I will look for these fruit buds. I will remove the low growth and thin the bush some, and I will count and leave 30 flower buds on a plant going into its 2nd year. That'll give me a couple of pounds of berries. And it will still allow the bush to continue to grow, because blueberries are not mature full size until they're 6 or 7 years old. So you can imagine we need to prune these so they don't produce too much fruit and can grow to their full size before we get mature production. So let me tell you how these grows, So see this whip growing from the base of the plant there on the left. So let's follow a whip like that. Whoops, going the wrong way. So here is a whip at the end of the growing season. So we're going to call this 1 year old. And next year, it's going to produce fruit at the tip if we don't prune it. And it'll produce shoots below the fruit. And those shoots are very important to support the fruit. But they're going to continue to grow during the season. And then in the winter, we will notice that those shoots have those fat flower buds at their tip. We call those laterals. So we have laterals and whips. So these laterals have flower buds at the tip. You can see the skeleton at the tip of that cane where the fruit was produced last season. So again, if I don't prune, what's that going to look like next growing season? So now all of those flower buds are going to break, produce berries, and we've got shoots growing below all those fruit clusters. Again, in the winter, what it looks like is this. Again, the skeletons of where the fruit was produced. We've got fruiting laterals below and flower buds at the tip of those. And then next year, when this is going to be a 4-year-old cane, look at all the fruit we have on it. Now, if you notice, as we've followed this cane through the season, the laterals, the shoots that are growing and that are present the following winter are getting shorter each year as the cane gets more complicated or older. And this is a natural process. And one of the reasons we prune is that if we don't prune, we get what's called twiggy growth. A cane that hasn't been pruned will just keep doing that, dividing and dividing and dividing. And you end up with extremely short laterals. If you can see my pointer here up against the sky, that is a lateral. That is what grew last year. The fat flower buds are at the tip, and there's really no lateral shoot below those to produce good shoot growth. So while we can get quite a few small berries from a cane like this, we don't get good shoot growth. So the berries will be tiny, they'll ripen later, and they won't taste as good or be as sweet as if we had pruned properly. When we don't prune, we get this, and you can kind of imagine we don't have good shoot growth. We have tons and tons of berries. And while you may think this is good, the trouble is this is not a mature bush. It's never going to get to full size if we don't prune it hard and limit fruiting during those immature years so it can have more vegetative growth than fruiting. What we want is this. We want really good fruit production in addition to good shoot growth to support the quality of that fruit and have enough good shoot growth that'll be good laterals next winter, so that we can get good consistent yield from year to year. So what are good fruiting laterals to look for when we're pruning? So again, these are the fat buds are going to be flower buds. The teeny scale-like buds are vegetative buds. And we call these laterals, fruiting laterals. And the best ones are 6 to 18 inches long in most cultivars. And within a cultivar, thicker diameter laterals will produce bigger berries. And so when we're looking at wood, and this is close to bud break, but when we're looking at wood this time of year, these longer laterals we want to keep when we're pruning. But these short, tiny ones, like the pruner's pointing to, we got to remove those. They're going to produce tiny fruit, which adds up in yield and decreases vigor of the bush. And also, it doesn't have good shoot growth. So we watch for this when we're pruning. So I'm going to show you some pictures of immature plants because it's hard to show a before and after of a mature bush. So these plants are going into their third growing season. So the planting year is your first season. We produced fruit in the second year on about 30 buds per plant. And now we need to eyeball, this plant is before pruning. And quite a few people would look at this and go, oh, I don't really need to prune that much. That's not true, because if we leave all these flower buds on here, it won't grow well and it'll never get to mature size. So remember, I'm going to be removing all the short laterals, crappy fruiting wood first, and then I'm going to cut even harder. So here's after. And notice I've opened up the center of the bush. I'm leaving really beautiful, long, thick laterals with fat fruit buds on here. Some new whips at the base. And this bush will produce a really nice, big sized for the cultivar, nice yield, and really good vegetative growth. Let me give you another example. Again, a plant going into the third growing season. This is before pruning, and here after pruning. We're just removing quite a bit of the growth. And when we see a bush that hasn't got as much growth as we'd like to see, like the prior bush had way more vigor. I hope you could see that. Look at how much more vigor there is. We've got this bright wood standing out with the buds on it, way more to choose from, some new growth from the base. This plant here is less vigorous. Maybe it produced a bit too much fruit last year. Maybe the soil's a bit heavy or wet in this spot. So I'm going to prune it harder to try and limit the fruit more so that it can really try and focus on root and shoot growth instead, a bit more this year. And then I can bring it back that way. So when we look at the basic principles of pruning, from establishing plants to mature plants, we want to prune a weak plant harder, take more wood off than a strong, vigorous plant. A larger proportion of the wood is removed. Like if I have a very vigorous bush and I prune it normally, I'm removing a lot of wood. But if I'm pruning, but it's still a small percentage, relatively speaking, because it's a big bush that's growing really well. But if the plant is stressed and is weaker, I'm removing a larger proportion. I may remove 50, 60% of the wood just to encourage it to grow more. Remove any diseased or dead wood first, which I won't get into, but hopefully that would stand out to you. Remove that first. Thin the new whips that grew last year from the base of the plant, choosing the most vigorous 3 or 4. A mature bush on a cultivar or variety that does produce whips at the base will produce more than that. Remove the twiggy growth that I pointed out to you. It'll stand out. If you step back from the bush, look for areas of the bush that are dull in color. New wood is bright. It's going to be either bright green, yellow, red, tan. Older wood is, gray and gets bark on it. So look for that twiggy growth and cut that out. Cut the entire cane out, or look for some better cane wood to prune back to, either a whip growing up on that older growth or a 2-year-old section that has good laterals on it. So look for things to prune back to. And thin the laterals. So keep the best 6 to 8 inch long laterals. Those will produce your best growth. So again, removing unproductive canes. Don't be afraid to cut an old cane out if there's nothing good to prune back to. But if you do see something good to prune back to, cut it back to that new vigorous growth. Ideally, we want to prune to an open center so we can maximize light exposure, and it's easier to pick because the fruit will be on the outside of the bush. And something I hear a lot from people is, how do I maintain a good picking height? Because these bushes can get over 6 feet tall. And so as the bush is starting to mature and get taller each year, as you're going to limit the crop by thinning laterals, look at tall, vigorous canes and they may have 10 good fruiting laterals on them, which is too many to get really good shoot growth as well as good fruit growth on a cane. And so then just take the top out and leave the 5 best ones. This way you're also minimizing the height when you're thinning and keeping the fruit lower down on the bush. Now, it's complicated to prune blueberries. I've given lots of demos, as I am here in the Marion garden. But I produced these pruning modules. The blueberry one is 2.5 hours long, 8 mini lectures. You wouldn't need to do the southern high bush ones. I did them for all of North America, that all of North America could watch them. And I've had rave reviews from home gardeners for these. There is a registration fee that gives you access all year long as much as you want. And if you buy more than one module, I have them for all the berry crops, it's cheaper. So have a look at that. And I have videos in these modules and talk through pruning for each stage of plant growth with quite a few videos on how to do it. So picking, after all this, you've done everything right, pick. Please. So one thing a lot of people don't realize is that when the fruit first turns fully blue, it's not ripe. So you could taste it. It'll taste a bit acidic, won't be as sweet. And the flavor and aroma comes on at the end of the ripening period, much like in grapes. So if you wait a couple of days to 3 days after fruit is first fully blue, it'll really taste a lot better. So generally, in your home garden, you don't want to pick more frequently than every 5 to 7 days, which means you have to protect the bushes from predators like birds, which I'll talk about. But, you know, your yellow Labrador, like we have, kids, grandkids. So netting them is a good idea. And the fruit stores really well in the fridge, easily 2-3 weeks. Yield 10 to 20 pounds on a mature bush if you've done it correctly and pruned it well, depending on the variety. So this is the net type of structure I use at home. It's just rebar in the ground, 1/2-inch PVC. That's it. I don't attach it to the rebar. I just stick it over the rebar. And then the net, usually 3/4 inch, and then some twine to hold it down. And I have a section where I can get in. All the other stuff doesn't really work very well. Birds get used to them, you know, and they know if that plastic owl hasn't moved for days. I mean, they're not, we may call them bird brains, but they're smarter than you think. So finishing up here with blueberries, the same questions, source, rate, and timing of fertilizer. Here's the key, and I see this as a common mistake in blueberries. So blueberries are adapted to low pH, and that's in soils, the predominant form of nitrogen at low pH is ammonium nitrogen. So that's what they're adapted to. In fact, blueberries can only use the ammonium form of nitrogen. So the trouble is, I recommended these well-balanced fertilizers for raspberries and essentially all other berry crops except blueberries, but they have nitrate nitrogen. And putting that on blueberries means you're putting salt on the plants, believe it or not, because they're very salty, these fertilizers. And also, you're going to have plants that are deficient in nitrogen because they can't use it. So you're not giving them the nitrogen they need. So if you want to use inorganic fertilizers, choose either ammonium sulfate, which is 21% nitrogen, or urea, which is 46% nitrogen. Those are very inexpensive, or rhododendron food is perfectly fine. It's more expensive. Any organic fertilizer, as I mentioned, all contain predominantly the ammonium form of nitrogen. Many also have other nutrients. You just want to, these don't release their nitrogen as fast. So we tend to apply them a bit earlier, like 2, 3, 4 weeks earlier. And I mentioned this in the Blueberry Home Garden publication, to give time for the nitrogen to be available to the plant. Now here's where you can use your composts carefully. If you put a light layer of compost, it provides a nitrogen source, ammonium nitrogen source. Just don't put too much of it on because it has a high pH. So having it on top of the soil is fine as a nitrogen source, even though we don't want to incorporate it prior to planting. Now, the rate of nitrogen to apply increases with planting age. So in the home garden publication, you're going to see a table that shows the amount per plant per age or how long it's been in the soil. Again, I'll talk you through in that publication on how to calculate how much product to apply, because I always give the recommendation as nitrogen as an element, not as a specific product. So you have to calculate that. And blueberries need their nitrogen. If the plant is flowering, they don't take up nitrogen until bloom. Now, on an established plant, blueberries bloom here in the Willamette Valley in late April. So I don't fertilize with an inorganic fertilizer until late April. They don't use it before then. It just leaches, is gone, and you're wasting money. With an organic product like soybean meal or feather meal, cottonseed meal, I put it on about a month before bloom. So now is a good time to start thinking about getting that fertilizer for your plant. And I divide the total rate into thirds. So you're applying not all at once. The plant can't take it up all at once. So you want to spoon feed these plants so they get the nitrogen that they need over the season, the early part of the season. So I'll finish with a gorgeous shot of Evergreen Huckleberry, Vaccinium ovatum. It is a native blueberry. Don't get me there. I had a whole OPB interview about these aren't really huckleberries. They're native blueberries. And I'll finish there and then open it up for questions. And I'm very happy that I kept it to the hour that I promised. So let me stop screen sharing. And I'll turn my video on. There we go. All right. So that was a whirlwind tour of 2 crops.
Thanks very much, Bernadine. We've piled up a number of questions in the chat box. Do you want to start with those? And
sure, whatever makes the most sense. Sure.
I think if you just read through the questions there in chat, and then if anyone feels that their specific question hasn't been answered or they want some clarification, then they can unmute and expand.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the earliest question, which was in raspberry. It says, I have single bearing raspberries. I assume that's a summer bearing raspberry, but we see some berries at the tip of the primocanes after I've pruned out the floricanes. I'm going to use some paraphrasing. These are not everbearing. In some cultivars like Willamette, for example, a floricane fruiting raspberry, they produce a little bit of fruit at the tip of a primocane when we have really extended autumns. And, you know, in an everbearing raspberry, you get like 33%, 40%, 50% of that primocane is fruiting starting in August. When a summer bearer produces a little bit of fruit on the primocane, it comes later in the year and it's just like a foot worth. You know, commercial growers see it quite frequently in extended autumns. They wouldn't pick it, but in the home garden, hey, bonus, just pick that. And when you go to train those in the winter, just prune that dead tip off. That's the first one. Haven't been able to find mini blues. Make me cry. I know it is so frustrating on how long it takes to get our new varieties into retail nurseries. I am so sorry, but keep Googling it. You should be able to find it. I'm hopeful because I was able to find it when I did the Blueberry Home Garden publication. So these things sell out really quickly, unfortunately. Are all blueberries self-pollinating or do they need companions? I love that. Companions. It's very social. They benefit from cross-pollination. So it's difficult to answer. All the varieties I just talked about are northern highbush and they are self-fertile. So if you have one plant growing in a pot, you will get fruit. It's just that if you have another cultivar of northern highbush, you'll get bigger berries and more of them. So they're self-fertile, but benefit from cross-pollination. And it doesn't matter which companion you choose. You can choose any cultivar. They all bloom at the same time, even if you're growing an early fruiting one and a late fruiting one. So that's good news. Let me table the table grape question until I do the berries we talked about. What about using pine needles as a mulch? Excellent. If you have pine in your yard, and pine needles are very acidic, they're about a pH of 4, and they work very well as a mulch. In fact, commonly used in Central Oregon as a mulch. Is it too late to prune raspberries or blueberries? No, it's never too late. It's blueberries you can prune all the way up till fruit set. The challenge you have is after the buds break, when you're pulling wood out of the plant, you can knock some buds off and some laterals off. So it is not too late. Go ahead and prune everything now. Take out the dead floricanes on your raspberry. It's a good time to top them or arcane train them. Take the dead tips off any everbearers, any short dead floricanes out. Get the whole planting cleaned up and ready to go for spring. Now's a good time to do that. Do the same soil type and pruning rules apply to huckleberries? So huckleberries are also vaccinium, so they're a native blueberry. My favorite huckleberries are the mountain huckleberry and the Cascade blueberry that grow up in the Cascades. They are not well adapted to Willamette Valley soils. So even though you can buy those, for example, Vaccinium membranaceum is the most common one you might find if you're hiking in the Cascades, Mount Hood or Mount Jefferson area. They're very tasty, but they don't grow well in the Willamette Valley. It's not the right ecotype. So you still might be disappointed. So go enjoy those out in the wild. The evergreen huckleberry, the one in the photo, the last slide I showed you, you can prune those in the winter to increase vigor and to increase the new shoot growth, because that's what makes them attractive ornamentals, is the red shoot growth, right? But then keep in mind, you're also limiting the flowering when you're pruning in the winter. So if you want to grow them as a flower crop, or you're growing them as a hedge and you want to trim it into a Mickey Mouse shape, heaven forbid. No, I'm not a fan of topiary. So if you want to prune your evergreen huckleberry hedge, do it after fruiting, so that you get you're pruning it right after fruiting. You're going to get new red shoot growth, which would be pretty, making Mickey hairy. And then they will still have, hopefully, time to set fruit buds so that you can enjoy the fruit next year. So treat it more like a forsythia in terms of the time of pruning. Why is Doug fir bark recommended for mulch on blueberry plants? Doug fir bark works. It's more expensive than sawdust. Sawdust is what's most commonly used. Why Doug fir? Because it's so plentiful in the Willamette Valley. It's not a magic tree. It could be any other. It could be hemlock. It could be redwoods if it's not too fresh. It's just something we have. And it's the bark is fine. You can sometimes more easily get that for home garden than you can sawdust. So it's low pH, and it's a really good product to use for blueberries. And as a mulch, because it dries out, the top layer dries out, when a weed seed blows in, it doesn't easily germinate. So that's one of the reasons why it offers some weed control. Let's see. Why can't you use sequoia needles in compost? Well, I didn't say you can't use sequoia needles in compost. So I'm wondering if you heard that somewhere else. The reason I said be careful with sequoia as a fresh amendment for the soil, fresh, not composted, is because it can have some phytotoxicity to it. It can, and like eucalyptus is the same, and cedar can do the same. If it's really fresh, so it's best to just leave it sitting for a bit so that those chemicals can leach out. Will ammonium sulfate fertilizer lower soil pH? Yes, but don't use it to lower soil pH because it won't work quickly enough. And elemental sulfur will, and you don't want to be adding all that nitrogen, which just leaches and into the groundwater included, and you don't need nitrogen when you're preparing the soil. So use elemental sulfur to lower the pH, and when you fertilize over the years, yes, ammonium sulfate will lower the pH slowly over the years. So adding a little compost on top helps mitigate that decline in pH, or you can use urea, which is less acidifying, or the organic fertilizers, which are less acidifying. Do you have advice for preventing root rot in raspberries? Choose a resistant or tolerant cultivar. Cascade Delight has some tolerance to root rot. That's why I recommend it. And drainage, drainage, drainage. That's it. Don't overwater, and have really good drainage is the best way. There's no other method of control for the home garden. Okay, someone has a bag of aluminum sulfate. Can I use it on blueberries versus ammonium sulfate? Those are two different products. Aluminum sulfate is sold as an acidifying agent to acidify the soil, but you're adding a lot of aluminum to the soil in addition to acidifying it. If I had a bag of it, I would use it. You could check the pH after it's had a chance to lower. It does not, don't use it on your plants because it's not a nitrogen fertilizer, and the blueberries don't want aluminum. They've got plenty in their acid soil. So don't use it as a fertilizer, but as if you happen to have some, you can add it to your acidification program prior to planting. Any advice about raspberries bred for containers, like raspberry shortcake? Well, let me tell you a story. When these ornamentals come out, I always want to test them because I always get asked, like you are, about whether it's any good. And so it's beautiful. What a great ornamental. I loved having it in a container on my deck. It's very pretty. It's Floricane fruiting. We have a yellow lab, Bella. She loves eating berries. And I thought, how am I going to grow a raspberry on my deck? Because it's at the right height for her. She never ate a single berry. And the reason is that Bella always picks ripe blackberries and raspberries. She can smell when they're ripe, the aroma. Well, a raspberry shortcake doesn't have any aroma, and it honestly doesn't have much flavor. So I could pick to my heart's content. It's just they weren't very tasty. So a very pretty ornamental, not a great fruiting plant. Arborvitae for blueberries. Dried old arborvitae, chipped up, I assume. To make anything, they would work fine if they were chipped up into a fine by a chipper. You could use them for the different sources, a mulch or as an amendment. Nothing to avoid. Again, you want to, if your plant has died, like if you have dead old arborvitae because they died of root rot, you might want to think twice. If they had Phytophthora ramorum or Phytophthora cactorum, about using them as a mulch or as an amendment. Like if your plant died, but if you lost it in an ice storm, like we have a lot of chipped wood right now, you can use that in your yard just fine. Okay, any other questions on blueberries and raspberries? I can go back to the ones I glossed over. Okay.
I don't see any new ones, so why don't
All right.
you go back?
Sure. Okay, I'm going back to the top here. And well, if you think of any other, I'm happy to handle any other questions.
Okay, well, Svetlana asked about training table grapes.
Right. Training of table grapes. Oh boy, Alan, you know, that's a complicated question. In the home garden, it so much depends on what space you have. So you can head train a vine, which is no trellis needed, and once the plant's mature, a single trunk with really nice spur pruning around it. Beautiful, can actually be quite a conversation piece in your yard. And that works very well. Certainly a pergola works extremely well, or an arbor. I love growing 3 different cultivars on an arbor, a white one, a red one, and a purple one, each on a side. And then I do short cane pruning with a long trunk so that my entire surface of the arbor is covered. I get shade that way, which is kind of the purpose of the arbor. And importantly, I pretend I'm Cleopatra and the berries are hanging down below the arbor. And if I'm lucky, my husband will feed me berries, but it never has happened. I'm just saying, that's a dream. You can also just build a short trellis and have plants side by side in a row. We have space here at home, and we have about 80 feet of table grapes in 2 rows, about 40 feet long. And I grow different varieties that I use for different things, fresh versus juice. And I use a Geneva double curtain on one, which is a divided hanging canopy. And then on the other, I use a single downward hanging canopy, a tall trunk again with all the shoots hanging down, that's spur pruned because those varieties like it that way. And I have a growing table grapes in Oregon publication that shows diagrams of all of these pruning methods and goes through all the cultivars that are different colors and seedless or seeded, and which I think are adapted best for our home garden where you don't want to spray for powdery mildew like a commercial grower would want to do or have to do. So who wants to do that in the home garden? So I would look at those. I don't spray my grapes at all, and I barely fertilize them. Let's see.
I think Svetlana also asked about honeyberry plants.
Dr. Maxine Thompson, she just passed away just about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. What a loss. Fantastic breeder. She lived a very rich life. She was about 94 when she passed away. A lot of her cultivars are available through nurseries, and her cultivars have Japanese names because she used the Japanese subspecies of Lanicera cerulea, the hascap. They need a cross-pollinator, and they're extremely easy to grow in the home garden, but you have to protect them from birds. I already have my net structure ready. I have 4 hascaps in my yard that are mature, 1 pollinator that I'm not too fond of their fruit, but 3 fruiting ones. And they're about to flower very early, but they're very frost tolerant, and they'll fruit before strawberries. And they're incredibly time consuming to pick, but boy, oh boy, do I love hascap fruit. I freeze it, make sauces. Would the sweetness of a seedless blackberry increase with age? Pretty sour the first year. I may need this question verbally because, first of all, there's no such thing as a seedless blackberry. It's not possible to have a seedless blackberry. Did you mean a thornless blackberry? So each druplet on a blackberry has a seed in it. So it's impossible to have a blackberry without seeds, or a raspberry without seeds. If it's thornless,
I just got a thumbs up from Deborah that that's what
thornless?
She must have meant.
Okay, so there are lots of different thornless cultivars, and I might give you some bad news here. Generally, it's possible that the fruit was particularly sour last year, and let me tell you why. We had a crappy year for fruit flavor in blackberry. it was a terrible spring. So fruit was developing when it was really cool and cloudy. And we didn't get really good sweetness on blackberry fruit at all. And in fact, a lot of the fruit rotted from the inside. The plug rotted first. And we got so many complaints by home gardeners about what is happening to my berries. When I go to pick them, the drupelets pull right off that central plug, which isn't supposed to happen. That's because it was rotted on the inside. So last year may have been an unusual year, but do you know the variety? If so, type it in or say it. There are some nasty sour blackberry varieties. I don't recommend them in my growing blackberries in the home garden, but they're readily available in nurseries, and how unfortunate is that? So I'm sorry if you bought one of those. I'm just saying. Let's see. I think one of my 2 boysenberry plants has crown gall. I went to remove it, but it had new growth at the bottom and I couldn't bring myself to take. I love boysenberry. Oh, so good. Do they ever recover? And will the other plant also get it? And are raspberry plants also affected? Okay, so crown gall is in the soil. So a trick to try and prevent spread is to not move that soil around. So if you're hoeing, hoe around that plant last. So that's one trick. If you're using your pruners, then prune that plant last, because it can also, the bacteria are systemic in the plant. So if you're pruning, it'll be on your pruners, and then the same crown gall will affect other plants like blueberry and raspberry and potentially other fruit plants too. Raspberry do get it less frequently than blackberries, but certainly you can see it in blackberries. So unless the crown gall is totally preventing new cane growth, keep it in as long as you can, practicing the sanitation things I just talked about. Because it's in the soil, you would have to choose a crown gall resistant type berry to put in that spot, even if you took it out. And crown gall can happen on many blackberry cultivars. They're quite sensitive. So if you're getting good growth, and remember the canes are biennial, so until the crown stops producing new primocanes, you can keep it in. As long as you're getting the primocane and it's fruiting the next year, then you cut it out. You can continue to enjoy it as long as possible. So that would be my advice there. Let's see. The dried inner leaves of Arbeite, can I use those as a mulch? The answer is yes. Okay. All right. I think that was it, other than some thank you for the positive comments.
Yeah, I see no more questions. So Bernadine, thank you very much for your presentation.
You are welcome.
I haven't grown blueberries and raspberries for a while, and it makes me want to try again.
Well, I know they're frustrating, especially blueberries, but seriously, if you follow those procedures, please look over the new publications, because it's been my goal to make those so that you could print them out and they would give you everything you need to grow them well. So hopefully that's the case.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.